Yeah.
I guess it's about time to begin. Welcome to our Revived Lyceum series. My name is Alex Gondola, and I'm the interim pastor here at First Congregational Church. And it's my privilege to introduce our speaker for tonight, although I suspect she does not need an introduction probably to most of you. Polly Cody is past president of the Milford Historical Society, which is our neighbor right over here on the same campus. She served on the Town Historical Commission. She's the author of the Carey House Chronicles, a lovely collection of stories about historical personages and organizations in this town. She's also written extensively for the Milford Cabinet and for the Granite Town Quarterly.
Yeah.
It was Polly who set up the historical walking tour of Milford, and recently she's been busy creating a QR, I'm not really up to the technology here, QR walking tour of downtown Milford. And QR is apparently something you get through your smartphone. I don't have a smartphone, so I don't know very much about that, but it sounds good. Polly has been a great friend of this church as well. We're very grateful for the historical information she shared with us over the years. A couple of years ago, when we just revived the Lyceum series, she gave a talk on our much revered Paul Revere Bell, and tonight she's going to talk about American Indians in Milford. Yay. Polly Cody.
We're going to cover a lot of area tonight. We're going to talk about the ancestral heritage of American natives and how the American natives arrived in this country. We're going to talk about New Hampshire, Amoskeag Falls, the Smith site, and then we're going to talk about American Indians in Milford. Next slide, dear. During the course of my 7-month research on this, I found that several researchers, geologists, and archaeologists all agree on one thing. The early inhabitants of this land all seem to have come across the Bering Straits at least 35,000 years ago. A Dr. C. Keith Wilbur had a publication, The Woodland Indians, and he believed that the natives were Duakte culture, a small hunting band who migrated from China and Japan, and their destination being the hunting grounds in northern China's glacial region, where the Ice Age animals went to graze on the tundra and broad grassland areas. These people penetrated into the Siberian area, which would have been up through in here, and eventually following the Pecora River Valley northward over the Siberian Valley just below the Arctic Circle. And they were following the woolly mammoth, the mastodons, muskox, caribou, moose, and deer as these animals were migrating across the Northern Territory. These people probably paid less attention to their surroundings as they crossed over onto Alaskan soil, and they took their place in history of inhabiting a great unknown continent. They would have been known as the Paleo Indians. Paleo means ancient, primitive, or archaic. And most of the American Indians descend from these people. Dr. Henry M. Morris is an archaeologist, hydrologist, and a hydraulic engineer, and he wrote a 700-page book called The Genesis Record, and it was published in 1976, and he has traced, let me see, where are we? This would be approximately where the Noah's Ark landed in Turkey, right here. And he traced Noah's son Shem and his descendants into the Chinese and Japanese cultures. Of course, this would have happened over many, many generations. And many of these nomadic people followed the animals that they hunted, eventually crossing the Bering Straits down through Canada, America, and down into South America. My husband and I spent the day with a state archaeologist, Dr. Richard Bovair in Concord, and he confirmed that DNA testing showed that American Indians descended from the Japanese and Chinese cultures. But exactly when did they come? The last ice age was known as the Late Wisconsin Glacier, which is actually this whole glacier area here. You can see New York City is here. All this is glacier through New England up through Canada. And this whole Siberian area that was all covered by a glacier 45,000 to 22,000 years ago. And the Bering Strait land bridge was dry and passable for thousands of years before and after these great ice buildups. Most archaeologists feel that the first crossing was at least 30,000 years ago, although some hold out to a more recent 15,000 years ago. It is possible that both are correct and that there is a series of crossings made each time there was a periodic freeze connecting these two continents. And in the Reader's Digest publication of 1978 called America's Fascinating Indian Heritage, their editor also states basically the same thing, that it may have been 50,000 years more ago that mankind began their epic journey into the New World. And so this makes it possible for us today to recreate the momentous adventure of man with a reasonable measure of certainty. During the last ice age, which ended about 12,000 years ago, the land bridge between Siberia and what is now Alaska provided a means of passage for the first immigrants to the New World. It was felt with most certainty that these forebears had lived for numberless generations in the Siberian tundra, which would have been up in this area here, hunting whatever animals they could find with their primitive weapons. Herds of caribou, bison, horses, whose carcasses gave them food, clothing, and material for their shelters, and they were always migrating. These hunters had to gather up their weapons, tents, and families and follow these animals or perish. Those who made the crossing were not explorers, settlers, or adventurers. They were simply hungry men and women following the game on which their livelihood depended. As they traveled, they came upon a wide variety of animals, many of which they had never seen before. Next slide, please. These are some of the animals that were on the North American continent when the Native Americans came down into the area. You'll see up here is the woolly mammoth. This is the American mastodon, the bear, full-grown horse, buffalo, the American lion, and a saber-toothed tiger. And it was estimated that this particular size beaver would have weighed 300 pounds when the American natives came into this country. So the animal population was quite a bit different than what we see it now. And other than maybe the beaver and the bear, we don't see these kind of animals anymore. I don't know how many of you watch Chronicle, but I think it was about 3 months ago, they had a segment on a father and daughter fishing team, and they were out dredging in the Atlantic Ocean, probably between Portsmouth and the Isle of Shoals, and they were dredging for clams, and they pulled up a woolly mammoth tooth. And that tooth, if a man were to put his two fists together, that's how big that tooth was. So these animals did live in this area. But as the Native Americans came across the continent, never once did they ever encounter another human being. So they are the true natives. And the reason, because there was a blank page in the history of the New World. There has been no evidence of any ape-like creatures in the Western Hemisphere, and so the first people who set foot there, those who followed and their descendants, were all men and women like ourselves with the same mental, physical, and capabilities. In North America alone, the land stretches from the Arctic Circle to subtropical Mexico and 3,000 miles to the Atlantic Ocean. And according to research, the Southwest has been inhabited for at least 6,000 years. All these hunters who migrated across Siberia following their prey had to learn to live in the frozen tundra, forests, grassy plains, and deserts, high mountains and deep canyons, rugged coastlines, lake shores, woodlands, and fertile river valleys. They had to develop new weapons, new techniques for hunting, learn to farm, forage for food, fish as a group for food to be dried and saved for the winter months, and had to find the natural medicines that were growing around them. They developed different kinds of dwellings, simple windbreakers, teepee-like structures, long houses, round houses, houses made of ice, and the huge apartment-type dwellings in the Southwest, all constructed of whatever materials were available in the region. They designed and constructed canoe-like crafts suitable for water transportation on quiet rivers to kill whales in the ocean. They learned how to make clothing from cured animal skins and from woven bark of trees. An important task was making tools for all the work, which showed enormous ingenuity as they made their tools from wood, bone, and in time, copper. They were all artistic, making magnificent pottery, baskets, and blankets. Trade was important in various parts of the country, and very early on they recognized the importance and advantage of exchanging their surplus raw materials and their handiwork for goods that were non-existent to them or in short supply in their particular region. Over thousands of years, they spread to every part of the continent and down into South America as well. As they adapted to the demands of the various environments, they developed many diverse cultures. Their game was plentiful, and they became exclusively hunters. Where fish was plentiful, they became fishermen. And where good soil was available, they became farmers and developed elaborate irrigation systems. Where no game, fish, or farmland was available, they became foragers and gatherers living off the land. Their habits, culture, and language was as different as the Europeans. And these people spread over North America with more than 200 tribes, languages, and dialects developed. This is a map of the United States, and this would be the Four Corners area of the Southwest, the Pacific area coming across into the western farmers, and then you get into the eastern woodland Indians and up into New England. And then you have up in this area, the Native Americans came across Canada, and there's all the Algonquin nations, and the Ottawas, and all the other different Chippewas, Ojibways, and all these other Indian tribes across the United States. Over the centuries, their descendants spread out over the two continents from Alaska to South America. As each pioneer group reached a new area, they came upon a wider variety of animals. Yet over the centuries, they and later migrants developed into a distinct people whom Columbus erroneously labeled Los Indos, thinking that he had landed in the East Indies. We do not know their names, and we do not know for certain when they actually came, but nonetheless, they are the true American pioneers. So that's sort of our history of where the Native Americans came from and how they arrived here. So now we're going to talk a little bit about New Hampshire. This is the state of New Hampshire, and you'll notice that the whole northern New Hampshire was the Abenaki. In southeastern New Hampshire, this would be the Concord area here and Bow. These are all the Pennacook Indians. The Pennacook Confederation lived in southeastern New Hampshire in a manner similar to their Algonquin linguistic relatives. And northern New Hampshire was the home of the Abenaki, their nearest relatives. Next one, please. Most of the natives lived in oval-shaped longhouses covered with bark, some preferring a dome-shaped, bark-covered wigwam during the winter months. The longhouse was between 25 and 50 feet in length and would hold up to 20 family members. And although during the winter, when the Indians moved farther inland and gathered into small groups, they lived in bark-covered wigwams, similar to the hide-covered teepees of the Plains Indians. They relied on agriculture, planting corn, beans, and squash, what they called the Three Sisters, for a large part of their diet, and supplemented this with agriculture, with trapping, hunting, fishing, and gathering of wild foods. Depending on their location and soil conditions, they would use fish to fertilize their crops to increase production. During most of the year, the Indians lived in scattered groups throughout the area and had their own hunting territories inherited through their fathers. They would gather in fixed and well-known locations in the spring and summer near fertile rivers or at the seacoast to plant corn, beans, and squash. Women harvested the crops in September. The corn was dried when mature and ground into meal on a cornstone for later use. They fished and hunted for deer, moose, and beaver, all under the direction of the eldest male or the best hunter. The meat was eaten or dried, and they used the bones, teeth, and hides for utensils, clothing, and shelter. They also gathered nuts consisting of butternut, black walnut, oak, hazelnut, berries like blackberries and raspberries that they could use for dyes, and herbs for medicine. These summer villages were usually small, numbering around 100 inhabitants. The groups changed from year to year as members would migrate through different regions, all at will to visit, trade, and depending on availability of fish and wildlife, to hunt to sustain themselves. One of the main fishing areas along the Amoskeag Fishway in Manchester. We're going to discuss this area quite a bit later. There were a network of riverways and trails through the territory, giving them great accessibility throughout their territories and regions during the warmer months. When winter came, they would return to their main village in Bow, in that area. The seasonal fish harvest at the Amoskeag site was their main source of food during the winter months, so they would smoke and dry their fish harvest and save it for the sparse winter months. These seasonal fish harvests also provided a festive atmosphere for sports, games, and where marriage contracts took place between groups. Women cleaned and tanned the hides using stone hide scrapers, tanned the hides, made bark bowls, utensils, and cared for the children. They sewed their garments from the tanned hides, made snowshoe strands from rawhide thongs. The women used shell beads, porcupine quills, and vegetable colors to decorate their garments. The men made the stone and wood utensils, the stone punches, to put holes in the hide for clothing, weapons, traps, tools, snowshoe frames, and wood ribs for their canoes. The work of each person, man or woman, complemented the whole village. The head or leader of each village was called a sagamore, whose wisdom and sense of community was all important for the survival of the village. This position usually passed down through heredity, and even women held this position when the husband died. They used herbal medicines for healing and used it widely throughout their villages. There was usually a medicine healer in each village who was known for their skills and knowledge of healing. The home of the Pennacook Confederation was in southeastern New Hampshire and also included northeastern Massachusetts, and that was called the Massachusetts Confederation. Did you ever wonder where Massachusetts got their name? Well, it's a Pennacook Indian name, Massachusetts. Their population could have been 12,000 or more in 30 villages. One author wrote that their homeland was probably considerably larger than along the Kentucky, Sauhegan, and Nashua and Merrimack rivers, possibly extending as far north as the Winnipesaukee River and west past Mount Kearsarge. The Sauhegan River runs northeast out of Massachusetts to the area shared with the Kentucky and North Nashua rivers. The Sauhegan Confederation may have utilized the entire Sauhegan drainage area to live and hunt. Their intermarriages between groups and family relationships bonded them together as they shared cornfields, fishing, and hunting areas. Children were raised within a community of relatives, each village consisting of extended family members. The name Pennacook is actually an Abnaki name, meaning at the bottom of the hill or downhill, with the majority of their villages located along the Merrimack River in the Manchester area during fishing season, and a more permanent village in the Bow area. Their language was very close to Abnaki. Their confederation consisted of many tribes, 3 names that we are familiar with even today. The Nashaway that lived along the Nashua River, with their village being in Leominster, Massachusetts. The Amoskeag, who lived at the Amoskeag Falls on the Merrimack River in Manchester during the summer. And the Sauhegan, who lived along the Sauhegan River somewhere along Amherst Milford area. Let's go to the next slide. We're now going to talk about the Amoskeag Falls site. This particular picture is of the Smith Mansion. It was on the east side of the Merrimack River in Manchester. In 1981, the New Hampshire Archaeological Magazine gave a detailed report of the excavation of the Amoskeag Falls Smith site, which was located on the east side of the Merrimack River on a high bluff overlooking Amoskeag Falls. In 1966, the archaeologists learned that the Amoskeag Bridge was to be replaced with a new and much larger bridge with new approaches. Also, the streets of River Street, West Salmon Street, and West North Street were to be leveled for a new parking lot for the New Hampshire Insurance Group building. This meant that the entire bluff along the Amoskeag Falls would eventually be destroyed. Let's go to the next one. It had long been known at the site on this bluff overlooking the Amoskeag Falls that it was one of the largest prehistoric sites along the Merrimack River through historical records and local collectors. About 1931, a Mr. Warren Moorhead from the Robert Peabody Foundation had obtained permission to sink test pits along the Smith estate. Some of these pits were placed right in the middle of Mrs. Smith's flower gardens, and these test pits showed evidence of Indian occupation down to depths of 4.5 feet below the surface. This site was a principal village of the Nomamuskeg, a band of Penacooks, and was an important fishing station and played a vital role in the Native American economy as well as in many socio-political matters. By 1966, Solon Colby obtained permission from the New Hampshire Insurance Company Group, owners of the land, to begin excavations at the Smith Mansion, as he had felt certain that this site was the most heavily utilized settlement in New Hampshire, and that the materials buried there would show great antiquity. In the summer of 1967, excavation began at this site with only a handful of volunteers on the south lawn of the Smith site. The excavation site was 50 feet by 100 feet. They wanted to extract as much information as possible before the site was destroyed forever. The project was funded by matching funds from the Bureau of Public Records and the Manchester Historic Association and Franklin Pierce College. Work continued until 1969, when construction of the new bridge made it impossible to continue their work. The Smith Mansion was torn down and the entire bluff was bulldozed and leveled, leaving only a parking lot and a paved approach to the Amoskeag Bridge. Among the most important data found from these sites, which also encompass the Neville site, were radiocarbon dates that placed the earliest occupation to 6,000 years BP, which they consider to mean before present. So that would be 6,000 years ago, and is taken on a few greater importance in the study of New Hampshire archaeology than was ever realized by any of the investigators. These next couple of slides show some of the arrowheads and pieces of stuff that they dug up. I think there's one more. And a lot of these range from different periods in archaic history. If something was determined to be Paleo-Indian, it was 11,000 to 9,000 before present. And early Palean was 9,000 to 8,000, and middle was 8 to 6,000 years, and late Archaic was 6,000 to 3,000, early was 3,000 to 2,000, middle 2,000 to 1,000, and late Woodland 1,000 to 400 years ago. And then there's the contact period, 400 to 200 years ago. And the contact period would be when the first Europeans met the Indians. Archaeologists' data failed to confirm the existence of any permanent villages at Amoskeag. The artifacts found from the Smith site excavation indicated that the site was occupied throughout prehistory, middle late Archaic and middle Woodland periods, and contained the most abundant remains. Artifacts from all prehistoric periods known in New England were identified in the excavated material, including samples of Paleo-Indian, Archaic, and Woodland periods. So that's a long time ago. Now we're going to kind of close in on things and talk a little bit about Milford. What's the next slide, dear? Okay. This is an old postcard picture of the Sauhegan River. When we learned a lot about Alberta Hager and Edith Hunter in their book, Milford, Our Hometown, and she wrote in 1963 that people who had made a careful study of New Hampshire do not believe that there was a permanent Indian village in Milford. No one has ever found remains such as a village or any artifacts that would show that a village had actually been here. The Indians did, however, pass through Milford a good deal. They used the river and brooks for fishing, the woods for hunting, and they may well have used some of the fine land along the Sauhegan River for their corn and squash. The Souhegan River appears to have been a favorite local spot for hunting and fishing for the Pennacook. You want to show the next 2 or 3 slides, dear? They're all beautiful scenes along the Souhegan River. This particular scene you may possibly recognize. It's a site that would have been behind the old Fletcher Paint Works in Milford along the Souhegan River. Just imagine Indians canoeing down the river, the Native Americans coming. The Souhegan River appears to have been a favorite location. Over the years, there have been many stories of arrowheads being found along the riverbanks where present-day people have been fishing, hide scrapers have been dug up. But no village or summer hunting camps have ever been found along the Souhegan River. Milford, however, does have a Native American Indian burial ground that was discovered in 1989. I had a long talk with a state archaeologist about this. I had lots of questions, and he told me if I knew the answer, I would not tell you. And he cautioned me about ever disclosing the location of the Indian burial ground because there are people who would go out there and try to dig it up. A child's remains were removed, analyzed, and recorded and determined to be 1,300 years old, which put it in the Middle Woodland period. It was also determined that there were at least 7 other burial graves at that site. The child's remains were finally reburied sometime after September of 1994. There were individual burials and some pottery and debris found, but the debris was determined not to be any kind of grave or ceremonial offerings. No other excavation was done at this site. The individuals buried in these graves may not actually have been Pennacook Indians, but they had some genetic or linguistic relationship to the total American Indian population. I will discuss a little bit after 1600. Prior to the European contact before 1647, there were as many as 12,000 Pennacook living in the area. Plagues had all but obliterated the Native American population in New Hampshire, with about 90% of them dying of disease brought by the Europeans, such as smallpox in the 1500s. The English in the early 1600s brought many epidemics of influenza and diphtheria, which also devastated the Pennacook population. The Wampanoags were the people who first met the English and French settlers and who taught them how to plant corn, bake clams, and how to bury a pot of beans in a hole in the ground at night in which a fire had been made so the beans would be cooked in the morning. They taught these settlers how to make canoes, to use seaweed to fertilize their crops, to eat pumpkin and squash. Farmers today plant 4 grains of corn in a hill. Why? The Europeans did things by 3, but the Native Americans went by 4, the number of the 4 directions. From these Native American forebears, we get such words as sagamore, sachem, tomahawk, squaw, papoose, quahog, hominy, and succotash. Corn on the cob, cornmeal, how to make popcorn, and making maple syrup came from these Native Americans. And next slide. Another view of the Souhegan River. And this is how they made their maple syrup. Innovations we know today, such as toboggans, snowshoes, and canoes, were used by them in travel over winter hunting grounds. And we also get the game of lacrosse from these Native Americans. The next slide. They were great lacrosse players. They welcomed the newcomers in friendship, and all along the coast, relations between the whites and Indians began with friendly treaties, and much help was given by the natives to the settlers. I have some things that I want to show you. I did a lot of beadwork over the winter. I'll pass these around so you can kind of get a feel of it. This would have been like a pipe bag. I got most of my materials from the Wandering Bull in Washington, New Hampshire, and a lot of direction from them. When women were out gathering their medicines in the woods, this would be a little medicine bag that, that they would carry on their belt to put their herbs in. This is a sash that men would wear across their shoulders. They might attach a powder horn to it, or something that wasn't too heavy that they could carry on it. Women might wear it as a belt. But they, each of the different confederations had different designs on them. That happened to be one that I found in a box, and it was tiny, tiny, tiny. And it took me quite a long time to copy it and make it that big. This would be something similar, and this would be more ceremonial. The Indians might wear this as an arm belt or as a leg belt around their waist or their feet, and more for dancing and that type of thing. About 20 years ago, we were planting asparagus and told to dig a trench 4 feet deep. So my husband dug a trench 4 feet deep, and down in the sand, we found these 2 pieces of stone. And I thought, well, maybe it's a tomahawk head or something like that. And I took it to an antique appraisal day, and the appraiser looked at it and said, oh, those are Indian hide scrapers. So I always thought that that's what they were. But when we took our visit to the state archaeologist, I had emailed him some pictures, and he said, they look like it, but I'd have to hang on to it, get it in my hand and feel it. So the day that we went up there, he and several other archaeologists held them and looked at them and said, no. Those are glacial erratics. Do you live on a hill? And I said, yeah, we do. And he said, we found them in the sand. And he said, they're just glacial erratics that keep coming down and coming down and coming down with the glacier. I said, well, what kind of stone are they? He said, they're granite. They're not what Indians would use. I said, well, they fit perfectly in my hand. And I said, you know, women use them, so it seemed to fit perfect. This is what, and not this small, but this is what the Native Americans would have used as a hide scraper. It's entirely different stone. He showed us a great big, huge one. Didn't look anything like these at all. And you can actually see the chippings and everything on this. This particular piece is only about 20 years old. This is not anything that's archaic. One of the things I really tried to do over the winter was quill work. Any Indian beadwork before 1800 would have been done out of porcupine quills. And beadwork came in once there was contact with a lot of the trading going on up in the Canadian area and down through New Hampshire and the whole East Coast. And quill work is very difficult. And you have to cut the barb off, which is very easy. Then you flatten it, but then you have to fold it and get it around something, which is very, very difficult. And I gave up after 2 hours and said, I really don't have time for this. So that's what dyed porcupine, and they come in all colors. You buy them, if you find a dead porcupine, you can pull the quills out. But I happened to get these from the Wandering Bull. They came in a bag, and they're every color you can imagine. And there are people who are very, very expert at doing quill work. But in the last 7 months, I really did not have the time or the patience to try to do some. But I did get the beadwork done. All of the books I used for research are over here, if any of you are interested in looking at them. These are 3 old New Hampshire archaeologist magazines that have a lot more pieces of arrowheads and whatever that were dug up at the Amoskeag site, if you're interested in finding out what more than the 4 slides you saw here. Very, very interesting reading. This is the book on the Genesis record, and this is the gentleman who connected the American Indians with Ham, who was one of Noah's 3 sons who left the ark. This is a 700-page book. It was so fascinating, I read it in 10 days.